Have you ever wondered what your children are doing when you're not around? The ones you trust to be safe at home? The ones you believe are doing their homework or playing games? What if I told you that behind the closed doors of your house, they could be stumbling onto something that would change their lives forever? Something you never even imagined possible? Michael and Isabella were best friends, both raised by loving parents who worked hard every day. Their parents thought they were safe, thought they were just kids playing or doing their school assignments. But one fateful afternoon, everything would spiral into a nightmare. It started innocently enough. Michael's mother had bought him a new phone, saying it was for his schoolwork. She told him, "Make sure you use it for your assignments," unaware of the temptation it would bring. As soon as their parents were gone, the two kids eagerly explored the phone, downloading games and chatting with each other. But as their fingers swiped across the screen, they stumbled upon something they didn't expect, an adult website. They didn't understand what it was at first, but they couldn't look away. There, in that small moment of curiosity, they were exposed to a world neither of them were ready for. What followed would change the course of their friendship and their lives, all because no one was watching, no one was checking. The consequences of their discovery would be far-reaching, and the parents would have no idea what had truly happened in their absence. Michael's heart raced as his finger hovered over the strange link on the phone screen. He looked at Isabella, who seemed equally unsure. "Do you think we should click it?" she asked, her voice low. Michael bit his lip, torn between the fear of what might happen and the overwhelming curiosity that pushed him to explore. He had heard about such things before, whispers from older kids at school, but he never imagined he'd actually stumble across it himself. With a deep breath, Michael tapped the screen. The page loaded, and suddenly a rush of unfamiliar images and sounds filled the screen. Isabella gasped, and Michael quickly pulled his hand away, his mind racing. "What is this?" he whispered, not sure how to process the strange feelings bubbling inside him. Isabella, her face pale, stared at the screen, her fingers frozen. "I don't know, but it's not what we're supposed to be seeing." The phone buzzed with notifications, but neither of them moved. It was as though they were stuck in place, hypnotized by the forbidden world they had discovered. The content was disturbing, confusing, and yet there was something about it that felt exciting. "Let's not tell anyone," Isabella said after a long silence. "It's our secret, just between us." Michael nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. This was no longer just a game or a mistake. It had become a secret that bound them together, a secret neither of them could share with their parents. They didn't know the danger that came with what they had just seen, but they would soon find out. The next few days went by without anything unusual. Their parents, as usual, left for work early in the morning, trusting that their children would be safe at home. Michael and Isabella continued to act normal, but something had shifted between them. They no longer saw each other the way they did before. Every glance, every whispered conversation was now tinged with the secret they had shared. The phone had become a symbol of their bond, their escape from the world of rules and expectations. One afternoon after school, they found themselves again in Michael's room, staring at the phone. Michael was hesitant at first, unsure if he wanted to dive back into the world they had discovered. But Isabella seemed eager. "Let's see what else is there," she urged, her eyes wide with excitement and fear. Michael didn't say anything, but he couldn't stop himself from clicking the link again. This time, it felt different. They weren't just curious, they were hooked. The hours passed in a blur, their minds consumed by the content they couldn't fully understand, but couldn't tear themselves away from either. Michael and Isabella had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. The phone, meant for homework and learning, had become their gateway to a dangerous and unsettling world. They both knew they were doing something wrong, but the pull was too strong. Every time they turned the phone on, they were drawn back into the cycle. Neither of them knew how to stop, and neither of them wanted to admit to their parents what had really been happening when they were supposed to be studying. As the days went on, the bond between Michael and Isabella's secret deepened, but so did the consequences of their actions. The phone, now a tool of secrecy, was no longer just a source of entertainment. It had become a dangerous influence, shaping their thoughts, their actions, and their desires in ways neither of them could fully understand. They began to grow distant from their families, lost in the world the phone had opened up to them. One evening, after a particularly long session on the phone, Michael and Isabella found themselves alone in Michael's room once again. This time there was no hesitation between them. What had started as a curious exploration now felt like something more. It was as if the phone had opened a door that couldn't be shut. In that moment, their innocent friendship shifted into something neither of them could control. The consequences of that day were something they didn't fully comprehend. The girl became pregnant, and both Michael and Isabella were forced to face a reality they weren't prepared for. But the real tragedy was that their parents never knew. They continued to go to work, believing their children were safe and happy, while everything was slowly unraveling in the background. It would take months before the truth came out, but by then, it was too late. The damage had been done. The days went by, but the guilt never left Michael. Every time he saw Isabella, he felt a pit in his stomach. What had they done? They were best friends. Zrania, but now their connection was tainted by something they couldn't undo. Isabella, on the other hand, seemed to have accepted it. She no longer spoke about what they discovered, but her eyes betrayed her every time they met. There was an understanding, a silent acknowledgement of what had passed between them. One evening after school, they met in the park behind their houses. The conversation was awkward at first. Neither knew what to say. "Michael," Isabella whispered, "what are we going to do? We can't keep pretending nothing happened." Michael nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "We have to tell someone, but who? Our parents would never understand." Isabella sat down on the swing, staring into the distance. "Maybe we don't have to tell them," she said softly. "Maybe we just keep it between us. After all, it's our secret, right?" Michael hesitated. He wanted to believe that, but a small part of him knew that secrets like this had a way of destroying everything. As time passed, their parents continued to live in ignorance, blissfully unaware of the changes happening in their children's lives. Michael's mother, unaware of the dark side of the phone, still encouraged him to use it for his studies. "Have you done your homework yet?" she would ask every evening, and Michael would nod, lying through his teeth. Isabella's parents were no different, assuming their daughter was spending her time studying or playing with Michael. But behind closed doors, the children were sinking deeper into a dangerous world. They began meeting more often, hiding in places where they wouldn't be interrupted behind the school, in abandoned buildings, even in the quiet corners of the local library. Every time they met, they revisited the phone, seeking more of the forbidden knowledge they had found. It became their ritual, something they couldn't stop. "I don't want to stop," Michael admitted one evening, his voice filled with uncertainty. "But I feel like we should. This is wrong." Isabella shrugged, her face set in determination. "It's too late for that now," she said. "We're already in too deep." One afternoon after school, Isabella came over to Michael's house, and they went straight to his room. As usual, they pulled out the phone, but this time, something was different. They no longer just watched the videos in silence. The temptation to act on what they saw had grown too strong. Their conversations shifted from hesitant glances to full discussions about what they had seen and what it meant. "What if we tried it?" Isabella asked one day, her voice trembling with a mix of excitement and fear. Michael recoiled, but the thought lingered. "I don't know, Isabella. That's crossing a line." But in the back of his mind, the desire to explore, to see what it felt like, was undeniable. "What if we just try it once?" Isabella whispered, "just to see what it's like." They both knew they were standing at the edge of something they couldn't unsee, but the urge to go further was too powerful to resist. For the first time, they crossed a boundary that would change their lives forever. The phone had opened a door, but it was their actions that pushed them through it. Weeks went by, and the weight of what they had done started to show. Michael and Isabella tried to act normal in front of their parents, but something had shifted. They no longer shared the same innocence they once had. Their smiles seemed forced, their laughter empty, but no one noticed. No one suspected a thing. One day, Michael's mother sat down with him, concern written across her face. "Michael," she said gently, "you've been acting strange lately. Are you sure everything is okay?" Michael looked up at her, his heart racing. He couldn't tell her the truth. He couldn't tell her what had been happening when she wasn't around. "I'm fine, Mom," he said, forcing a smile. "Just tired from school." Isabella's parents, too, noticed her growing distance. "Isabella," her mother asked one evening, "you've been so quiet lately. Is something wrong?" But Isabella simply shrugged, offering the same excuse. "I'm just tired, Mom." Nothing's wrong. Yet deep down, they both knew something was, but neither parent suspected what lay beneath the surface. With each passing day, Michael and Isabella's bond grew stronger, but so did the distance from their families. The phone remained their secret. They would meet in private places, continue exploring the dangerous world they had uncovered. They didn't know how to stop, and each time they tried to break free, they were pulled back in. Their lives began to unravel in subtle ways. Michael became withdrawn, skipping meals and avoiding his friends. Isabella became more distant from her parents, spending hours alone in her room. They were both consumed by the secret they shared, unable to escape the dark grip of what they had discovered. The inevitable happened. One evening, after another secret meeting, Isabella realized something was wrong. She hadn't felt this way before. She was late in a way she couldn't ignore. Panic set in as she realized the consequences of their actions. She immediately called Michael, her voice trembling with fear. "Michael, I think something's wrong. What if I'm pregnant?" Michael's heart skipped a beat. He had been expecting this, but hearing Isabella say the words out loud felt like a punch to the gut. "What are we going to do?" Isabella whispered, her voice filled with terror. The fear was overwhelming, and neither of them knew how to deal with it. They couldn't tell their parents. They couldn't go back to the world they once knew. They were in this together, but now they were trapped. Isabella knew she couldn't keep it a secret for much longer. She had to tell someone who could help them. But who? Michael was just as lost as she was, and neither of them trusted anyone enough to share their burden. They began talking in hushed tones about what they should do. "Maybe we can just hide it," Michael suggested, his voice full of uncertainty. "Maybe no one will notice." But deep down, they both knew that wasn't possible. The truth would come out eventually. But how would they explain it? How could they tell their parents what had happened when they weren't there? The days turned into weeks, and still the pull of what they had discovered on the phone was too strong for Michael and Isabella to resist. The two friends continued meeting secretly, sneaking around their homes to find moments when their parents were distracted. Each time they delved deeper into the forbidden world they had unlocked, their curiosity growing with each encounter. It was no longer just about watching, it was about feeling, experiencing, and trying to understand what they didn't fully comprehend. One evening after dinner, Isabella came to Michael's house. She looked nervous, but the glint of excitement in her eyes was hard to ignore. "Michael," she whispered, "I think we should try it again. I can't stop thinking about it. We should know more about what we saw." Michael hesitated, but the temptation was too great. "You're right. We need to understand it." "Just one more time," he said, though his heart raced as he spoke. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with anticipation. They sat on Michael's bed, the phone between them. As they opened the app again, it felt like they were crossing a line they couldn't return from. The content seemed darker now, more intense, but they couldn't look away. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was a need, an addiction. They tried to replicate the actions they saw, not really understanding what they were doing, but simply drawn to the idea that it would give them answers. After that night, things started to change. The initial feelings of guilt began to fade, replaced by a strange sense of familiarity. Michael and Isabella began to feel like this was just a part of their lives. They saw each other more often, meeting in secluded places, parks, empty classrooms, or behind the old library. Each time they returned to the phone, to the videos, to the actions they saw. "You don't think it's wrong anymore, do you?" Isabella asked one afternoon, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael, still unsure, shook his head. It's not like we're hurting anyone. We're just curious. It's just between us." But even as he said the words, he knew they weren't true. They were crossing a line. They both were, and they knew it. Isabella was the first to suggest it. "What if we just try what they did? We don't have to tell anyone, just us. We can stop whenever we want." Michael was silent for a moment, his heart pounding, but the pull, the unspoken desire, was too strong. "Okay, just once," he whispered, and so they did. What began as innocent exploration quickly spiraled into a dangerous game. They didn't fully understand what they were doing, but the more they tried to mimic what they saw on the phone, the harder it became to stop. The more they met, the more their lives seemed to drift from the ones they had known. Isabella became quieter at home, retreating into herself. Michael started staying late after school, avoiding his parents' gaze whenever they asked where he had been. The weight of what they were doing was pressing down on them, but neither knew how to stop. One evening, as they sat together in Michael's room, Isabella looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Michael, do you think this is wrong?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. "What we're doing, it doesn't feel right, but I can't stop." Michael looked at her, his own guilt eating him up inside. "I don't know anymore, Isabella, but I can't stop either." They both knew they were in too deep. The phone had given them something they couldn't undo, something they couldn't unsee, but they couldn't stop, not when the desire to try again burned so deeply. Their encounters grew more frequent, and with each one, the lines between them blurred. What had once been an innocent friendship was now tainted by something darker, something they couldn't fully understand, but couldn't escape. They tried to go back to their normal lives, but the weight of their secret pulled them back together, every time. One afternoon, after a particularly long session on the phone, Isabella approached Michael with a new suggestion. Maybe we should try it more," she said. "We're not learning anything just by watching. We need to understand it, to feel it, so we know what it's about." Michael hesitated, his heart racing at the thought. "Isabella, we can't keep doing this. What if someone finds out?" But Isabella wasn't listening. "What if no one does? We're just curious. It's just us, Michael. No one else has to know." And so they met more frequently, continuing to push the boundaries of what they'd learned from the phone. The more they did, the harder it became to control their actions. They were no longer just playing a game. They were seeking answers, seeking experiences that their young minds couldn't fully comprehend. Days later, Isabella missed school. Michael was concerned, but when he visited her house, she looked pale and distant. "I don't feel well, Michael," she whispered when he knocked on her door. At first, he thought it was just a flu or maybe something else minor, but as she avoided his gaze, his worry deepened. "Isabella, are you okay?" he asked. She hesitated before finally speaking. "Michael, I think I'm pregnant." The words hit him like a ton of bricks. He couldn't speak at first, his mind racing. He hadn't even thought about the consequences. They hadn't used protection. They hadn't even understood what they were doing. It had all been a mistake that had led them to this point. I don't know what to do, Michael," Isabella said, her voice breaking. "I never thought it would happen. We weren't careful. We were just playing." Michael's world shattered in that moment. The consequences of their actions were no longer something they could hide from. "We can't tell anyone," he said, his voice low. "We can't tell our parents. They'll never understand." But even as he said it, he knew they couldn't keep the secret forever. It was too big to ignore. But what could they do now? They were trapped by their own choices. The two friends spent the next few weeks trying to hide the truth from their parents. They tried to act as if nothing had changed, but the tension between them was palpable. Michael found himself constantly on edge, wondering if anyone would notice the shift in their behavior. Isabella became more withdrawn, her once bright eyes now shadowed by the fear of what was to come. They tried to figure out a plan, a way to deal with the situation without anyone finding out. "Maybe we can just pretend it never happened," Michael suggested one evening. "Maybe no one will ever know." But deep down, both of them knew the truth couldn't stay hidden forever. They were running out of time, and soon the consequences of their actions would become undeniable. As the days wore on, Isabella's condition became more apparent. She was tired all the time, and she couldn't hide her growing fear anymore. "What are we going to do, Michael?" she asked one evening, her voice trembling. "What if we get caught? What if someone finds out?" Michael didn't know what to say. The fear in Isabella's eyes mirrored his own. The thought of their parents finding out, of facing the consequences of their actions, was terrifying. But even more terrifying was the fact that they had no idea what to do next. They were trapped in a web of their own making, and no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't find a way out. Isabella couldn't hide her fear anymore. Her condition was becoming more obvious, and each day that passed felt like a countdown. The secret they had been carrying was growing too heavy to bear. One evening, as she sat in her room, staring at the wall, she realized that she couldn't face it alone anymore. She needed to tell someone who could help them. "Michael," she said when they met at their usual spot behind the library, "I can't do this anymore. I don't know what to do. What if my parents find out?" Michael looked at her, his face pale. He had been avoiding the subject, too afraid to confront it. But now, seeing Isabella so broken, he knew they couldn't keep running from the truth. "We can't tell them yet, Isabella. They won't understand. They'll never forgive us." "But what if it gets worse?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What if I can't hide it anymore? What if someone sees?" The fear in her eyes was raw, and Michael could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on both of them. For the first time, Michael realized they were no longer just trying to hide a mistake. They were living a lie that was growing with every passing day. He felt trapped, unable to make a choice that wouldn't change everything. "I don't know what to do," he whispered, his voice filled with panic. "But we need to figure this out before it's too late." A week later, things began to unravel. Isabella couldn't hide the truth any longer. She had missed her period, and the sickness she felt every morning was becoming impossible to ignore. Her once glowing face had turned pale. Her eyes were shadowed with exhaustion. Every time she looked at Michael, she saw the same fear reflected in his eyes. But neither of them could find the words to make it better. One afternoon, Isabella's mother came into her room while she was lying on her bed, her hand over her stomach. "Isabella," her mother said softly, "you don't look well. Are you feeling all right?" Isabella stiffened. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she couldn't lie anymore. The weight of the truth pressed against her ribs. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. I think I need to tell you something," Isabella said, her voice barely a whisper. I think I might be pregnant." Her mother froze, her expression unreadable. "Pregnant? What do you mean? You're just a child, Isabella. How could this happen?" Isabella felt the tears threatening to spill, but she held them back. "I don't know, Mom. I don't know how it happened. It was a mistake. I didn't mean for it to happen." Her mother's face softened, but there was still shock in her eyes. "You're not a child anymore, Isabella, but we'll figure this out. You don't have to go through this alone." The relief Isabella felt was fleeting. She had confessed, but she couldn't shake the guilt that gnawed at her. She had betrayed her parents' trust, and now she had to face the consequences.
When Michael found out that Isabella had told her mother, he panicked. He didn't know what to do. He couldn't avoid the truth anymore. But the thought of telling his parents terrified him. How would they react? Would they even believe him? He couldn't imagine the anger, the disappointment, the shame that would follow. The next day, Michael's mother called him into the living room. Her face was serious, and he knew something was wrong. "Michael," she began, her voice low, "Isabella's mother called me today. She said you and Isabella need to talk." Michael felt his heart race. He knew exactly what was coming. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, his palms sweating. "What did she say?" His mother's eyes softened, but there was a hint of worry in them. "Michael, we know about what happened. Isabella told her mother, and her mother called me." Michael froze. It was all out in the open now. "I didn't mean for this to happen, Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking. "It was a mistake. We didn't know what we were doing. We never meant to hurt anyone." His mother looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and sadness. "How could you, Michael? How could you keep something like this from us?" She paused, her voice trembling. "You're still a child. You don't understand what this means." Tears filled Michael's eyes. He had disappointed her. He had disappointed them all. The weight of his actions crushed him, and for the first time, he truly understood the consequences of what he had done. In the days that followed, the weight of the situation seemed to suffocate Michael and Isabella. Their parents were angry, confused, and hurt. Michael's mother cried for hours, unable to comprehend how her son had gotten involved in something so dangerous. Isabella's mother, though more understanding, was still filled with concern about how this would affect Isabella's future. Both families agreed that something had to be done. Isabella would need to see a doctor to confirm the pregnancy and figure out what their next steps would be. Michael's parents, though upset, promised to help him through this, but the rift between them and their son was evident. There was no going back from this.
"We'll figure this out," Isabella's mother said softly, holding her daughter in her arms. "But this will change everything." Michael sat alone in his room later that night, his mind racing. He had always heard stories about people making mistakes, but he never thought he would be one of them. He had ruined his life, and Isabella's life too. There was no going back to the innocence they had once shared. Days turned into weeks, and the reality of what they had done set in. Michael and Isabella barely spoke. They were both living with the weight of their actions, isolated from the people they once considered family. Their parents didn't know how to treat them anymore. They were no longer the innocent children they once were. At school, things were different too. They had both become the subject of whispered conversations. Students looked at them with pity, and some even avoided them altogether. The guilt weighed heavily on their hearts. They had once been friends, but now they were strangers in their own lives. Days turned into weeks, and for Michael and Isabella, nothing felt normal anymore. The whispers at school never stopped. Everywhere they went, there were looks, sometimes sympathetic, other times judgmental. Both of them had become the subject of conversations they didn't want to be part of, and every time they met, there was a silent acknowledgement of what had happened. They were now forced to navigate a world that felt both foreign and unforgiving. Michael spent most of his time at home, locked away in his room, staring blankly at the wall. He couldn't bring himself to face his parents anymore. Every conversation with them felt strained, as if they were both walking on eggshells around him. His mother would ask him questions, but there was a sadness in her voice now. A sadness that made him feel like he'd let her down in ways he couldn't fix. One evening, as Michael sat at the dinner table, his father cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Michael," he began, his voice firm but quiet, "we need to talk about what happens next." Michael's heart sank. He knew what was coming, but hearing it out loud made it real. He looked up at his father, his mind racing. "I don't know what to say," he whispered.
"We're going to figure this out," his father said, but there was no warmth in his words. "But you need to understand that this is a serious situation. There are consequences to your actions." Michael nodded, but the weight of his father's words felt unbearable. He had ruined everything, and now it seemed there was no way out. He wanted to fix things, but nothing could erase what he had done. Isabella, too, was struggling. She hadn't spoken to Michael in days, but the guilt gnawed at her every waking moment. She lay in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how things had spiraled so far. It had all started with a simple curiosity, but now here they were facing a future they never thought possible. Her mother had been more understanding than Michael's, but even she couldn't hide the worry in her eyes. They had Je and what everyone else expected of her. One evening, her mother asked her, "Isabella, do you want to keep the baby?" Isabella hesitated, tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't know, Mom. I don't know what to do. I'm not ready for this. But I don't want to disappoint you either." Her mother sighed, pulling her into a tight hug. "You won't disappoint me, darling, but you need to think carefully about what's best for you." Isabella was trying to be supportive, but the weight of the decision pressed down on her chest. There was no right answer. She felt like she was drowning in a sea of choices, each one more overwhelming than the last. As the days went by, the pressure on Michael and Isabella intensified. Their once carefree lives had been replaced by fear, shame, and uncertainty. They were constantly reminded of the consequences of their actions, and the future seemed impossible to face. At school, the atmosphere was different. Students avoided them, whispering behind their backs. Michael couldn't take it anymore. The isolation, the stares, the constant reminder of his mistake, it was too much. One afternoon, as he walked home from school, he felt a wave of panic wash over him. He couldn't go back to his house, couldn't face his parents, not yet. Instead, he found himself walking aimlessly through the streets, hoping that if he just kept moving, he could outrun the storm inside him. Isabella, too, was struggling with her own demons. Her friends had all distanced themselves. No one knew how to talk to her anymore. She found herself sitting alone in the park, staring at the empty swings. Her once vibrant world had become a lonely place, filled with regret and uncertainty. But amidst the loneliness, Isabella found herself questioning everything. Was this the life she was meant to have? Could things ever go back to normal, or had they crossed a line from which there was no return? It was late one evening when Michael's phone buzzed. He hadn't been able to focus on anything for days, but the notification caught his attention. It was from Isabella. "We need to talk." His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't spoken to her in days, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to face her again. But something in the message told him he couldn't ignore her. She was struggling just as much as he was. He grabbed his jacket and headed out the door, making his way to the park where they had met so many times before. When he arrived, Isabella was already there, sitting on the same bench where they had spent so many hours laughing and dreaming. But tonight, her eyes were different, darker, filled with confusion and fear. "Michael," she said softly as he sat beside her. "I don't know what to do anymore. I don't know how to make it right." He looked at her, his heart heavy with the same uncertainty. "I don't know either, Isabella. I wish I could fix it, but I don't know how. I never thought it would get this bad." Isabella sighed, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "I wish I could go back. I wish I could just erase everything." Michael felt the same way, but he knew that was impossible. "We can't go back, Isabella, but maybe we can figure out what to do now. Together." As the weeks turned into months, the reality of their situation began to settle in. Michael and Isabella's lives had changed forever, but somehow they were finding a way to live with the consequences. They attended counseling together, working through their emotions and the guilt they had been carrying. It wasn't easy, but they were learning how to forgive themselves and each other. One evening, as they sat together in the park, watching the sunset, Isabella turned to Michael with a small smile. "Maybe this is just the beginning," she said quietly. "Maybe we don't know what's ahead, but we can face it together." Michael nodded, a sense of peace washing over him. "Yeah, we'll figure it out. We always do." The story of Michael and Isabella had become a lesson, not just for them, but for everyone around them. The consequences of their actions had been far-reaching. But they had learned valuable lessons about responsibility, trust, and the importance of parents staying connected to their children. Though their lives had been forever changed, Michael and Isabella knew they couldn't undo what had happened. But they had choices to move forward, to grow, and to face the challenges ahead, stronger than before. And for the first time in a long while, they felt like maybe, just maybe, there was hope.